all of you out. There's never been a sermon quite like the mountain message of Jesus. Matthew chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7. It stands all by itself as the most remembered sermon that has ever been given. The Sermon on the Mount contains the totality of the teachings of Jesus. And here is the essence of everything that Jesus has taught. Here is the secret on how God wants you to live. Again, this is God's how-to sermon. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, go ahead and look there. Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. When he saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to teach them, saying, and so when you think of the Beatitudes, what word comes to mind more than any other word? Well, you see it there. It's blessed. Blessed. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. And blessed are those who are persecuted. Blessed. He starts off by saying, blessed are the poor in spirit. And we talked about that a few weeks ago. Blessed are those who come to realize that without God, they have absolutely nothing. Without Him, you are destitute spiritually. You are completely broken without Him. And the question is, how do you feel about that? Well, we talked about the woman in Luke chapter 7, verse 38, who wept over Jesus. Here is a broken woman, and she's washing Jesus' feet with her tears. She's mourning over the person that she is. And she had come to the right source. And so, blessed are the poor in spirit. Well, that was that woman. She was poor in spirit. And blessed are those who mourn, and that's what she's doing. She's mourning over her sin. And that's what God wants us to do when we realize our spiritual destitution. But this morning, we're going to look at the next one. We're going to look at blessed are the meek, or blessed are the gentle. Blessed are the meek. Because when you finally realize, number one, that without God, I am absolutely nothing. And when you mourn over your sin like the woman who wept over the feet of Jesus, or like the publican who stood afar off and beat his chest and said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. When you feel that and understand that you are lost before God, blessed are the meek, the humble, the gentle, whose attitude is, Lord, your will be done, not mine, yours. You see, there is that natural progression in all of this. As we stated, these are not just one-line statements from Jesus. A natural progression from one step to the next. You can't get to the next step without having the previous one. I would think of all the things that Jesus taught, this is probably one of the most misunderstood. Blessed are the meek. Because in our way of thinking, as we live in a very cutthroat society in which only the strong survive, then in our way of thinking, if you're a meek person, then you're going to be taken advantage of. You can't be meek. You can't be gentle. You're going to be taken advantage of again and again and again, and you're going to get ripped off. I mean, the quickest way not to succeed in life is to be meek and lowly and gentle and humble. If you want to get a parking place in the month of December, when you go to a mall or an outlet mall or whatever, meekness is probably not going to help you. It's not. I mean, you've got to be aggressive. You've got to be an aggressive driver. You can't be meek. You got to fight for your rights. You know, that's our culture. That's our society. And yet Jesus actually said the opposite. He said, blessed are the meek, for they are the ones who shall inherit the earth. I found this quote, and I don't know who to give credit to, but it says, "The rain falls on the just and the unjust, but mainly on the just, because the unjust steals the just umbrella." I thought that was pretty funny. But that's life. That's society. That's the culture in which we live. It's a tough world. It's hard. Only the strong survive. The meek person, at least it would seem to us, just kind of gets run over in this whole process. But maybe our problem is we're not understanding what Jesus really is saying here. Maybe we're not defining meekness correctly, and so maybe that's where we need to start. Blessed are the meek. Well, what does this mean? Meekness. Think about how most of the world would define meekness. What they would say is weakness. I think most people equate meekness with weakness. And yet that's not the idea at all. That's not what Jesus is saying. Again, we live in a culture where you've got to look out for number one. You've got to look out for yourself. You got to be tough. You got to be aggressive. You have to be assertive. If you're climbing the ladder of success, if somebody gets in your way, what do? Well, you just push them out of the way because I'm getting to the top. You see, that's the way to succeed, and that's the way to power and position and success. And Jesus said, no, it's not. No, it's not. Verse 5. Who's going to inherit the earth? Who is it? These kind of people that's going to inherit the earth? That's not what it says. The meek and the gentle are going to inherit the earth. What if in a post-game news conference for, let's say, the University of Florida, after they lost a game, what if the coach said, if we're going to change things around here at Florida, then here's what we have to do. We have to start recruiting more meek and gentle players. What would you think if a coach said that? What do you think would be the natural response to that statement? How do you think the media would react to that statement? Did you hear what the coach said? He said they need meek and gentle players. They would think that's crazy. They would think that he lost his mind, and they would be writing in newspapers all over the place. They would probably fire that coach for saying that. But that statement, if you stop and think about it, when you understand what meekness is all about, that coach would be absolutely correct. He would be 100% correct. Because meekness is not weakness. Meekness is not a spineless, cowardly person that we tend to think of. That's not what it is. It's totally different. God's view of meekness, number one, is associated with being teachable. In other words, a meek person is someone who can be taught. Have you ever known somebody who is they're not teachable? You've tried and tried, but they're just not teachable. Well, why are they not teachable? Well, it's because they think that they already know everything. Who are you to tell me? Who are you to tell me how this is? And so they're not humble. They're not meek. You can't teach them anything because they already know it all. But meekness describes the person who is willing to be taught. Psalm chapter 25 and verse 9 says, he leads the humble in what is right and teaches the humble his way. Well, the humble are the only ones who can be taught. They're the only ones. James chapter 1 and verse 21. Therefore put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. Meekness implies a heart that is open. It is receptive. It doesn't know everything. It's willing to learn. Look with me at Luke chapter 1 and verse 38. In Luke chapter 1 and verse 38, I love the disposition of Mary when the angel told her what was going to happen in her life. Look at what she says in Luke chapter 1 and in verse 38. She said, "See, I am the Lord's servant," said Mary. "May it happen to me as you have said." May it happen to me as you have said. That is meekness. That is a heart that is teachable. That is a heart that is open to the direction of God. You lead me. Let it be to me according to your word. That is teachable. Secondly, how about lowliness? When Jesus described himself in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 29, he said, "I am gentle and lowly in heart." I am meek. I am gentle in heart. So there is meekness and there's lowliness together. In other words, the meek man is the one who has emptied himself of himself. He has emptied his heart and filled it with God. It's the very opposite of self-inflation and selfishness and self-righteousness and egotism. You see, this is foreign to the lifestyle of a meek person. The attitude of one who says, "Make me a servant. Make me a servant." That is the idea of meekness. Jesus said that he didn't come to be served, but to serve. He said that he came to serve and to give. Now, if Jesus' motivation upon the earth was to serve, what about us? What should our motivation be? It should be the same. It should be the same as his. It's not about me. It's not about you. It's all about him. It's all about him. And it is following him. It is humbling yourself and serving other people. That's what it's all about. Lowliness of heart. Third, about gentleness. Some of these terms are used interchangeably. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 1. 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and in verse 1. "Now I, Paul, myself appeal to you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. I who am humble among you in person, but bold toward you when absent." There you see meekness and gentleness together. I also wrote down the word kindness. Gentle, kind. I mean, in my thinking, it's the opposite. It's the opposite of harshness. It's the opposite of harshness. It's the opposite of violent. It's the kind of disposition that again, it's not hateful. And that's what Jesus was. Jesus was gentle. He was kind. And then also patience. Look back in the Old Testament at Psalm chapter 37. Psalm 37. Notice what it says in verses 7 through 9. Psalm 37, beginning in verse 7. "Be silent before the Lord, and wait expectantly for him. Do not be agitated by one who prospers in his way, by the person who carries out evil plans. Refrain from anger and give up your rage. Do not be agitated. It can only bring harm. For evildoers will be destroyed, but those who put their hope in the Lord," or some versions say those who wait on the Lord, "will inherit the land." So those who wait on the Lord will what? They will inherit the land. They will inherit the land. Who will inherit the land? Well, the meek, the humble. And so in this passage, the psalmist is reminding us that those who will inherit the land are patient. They're patient because they're waiting for the Lord. There are those who wait for the Lord in verse 9, and those in verse 11, the meek and the humble. They are the same person. They're the exact same person. And so there is the quality of patience. Let me ask you, again, is it easy to wait? it's not easy to wait. I don't think it's easy for any of us to wait. Because, again, in our society, we've gotten used to the quickness. And if we don't get what we want right then and there, then we're not happy. I've seen the bumper sticker. I don't know if you've seen it before. It makes me laugh every time I see it. It says, "Lord, give me patience, ... now." And that's kind of how we are. Lord, please do this for me now. Please give me this now. Right? That's the way a lot of people are. Again, you remember as a kid, Christmas is coming up. I remember as a kid, I just could not wait for Christmas. And it just took forever because my birthday is at the end of November and then end of December, so I had to wait a whole year, right? And so it wasn't, I was excited for Christmas. And it just seems like that day is never going to come. But now we grow out of that, right? We grow out of that. We pass our childhood, and here we are now as adults, and we grow out of that impatience, right? Yes or no? No, I'm not sure we ever grow out of that. I think that is something that we always have to work on. But I've seen some grown-ups who have a problem with patience. I know of them in particular, one of them in particular, and he looks back in the mirror every single day. That's me. I struggle with this. I just the other day, I'm sitting at a red light, and it turned green, and the lady just sat there. And I think maybe 3 seconds passed by when I was already hitting my horn. I was ready to go. Now, I don't like to wait. But again, I have to be careful sometimes because, what we say, especially if we have kids, what we say, little ears pick up. I'm thinking, lady, what do you want another color? Well, what's your problem? Well, children will hear something like that, and they pick up on that impatience. And then guess what happens when they begin to drive? They start to get frustrated because, well, that's what mom or dad did when the person didn't go. And so now I'm going to make comments. I'm going to say things. Again, we have to be careful because what it reveals sometimes is our lack of patience. Now, again, there's times when I have to, and you probably have to do the same. I have to pick my battles because you know what pushes your buttons and what sets you off, and so you have to avoid certain situations because you can become very, very impatient if you're not careful. But my point is, we grown-ups have the same difficulty as little children who are just, they can't wait. They can't. They struggle with that. But my point is, we have the same difficulty. And the psalmist is reminding us that part of being humble and part of being meek is being patient. The word meekness originally meant to tame an animal. That's what it originally meant, to tame an animal. And it conjures up a picture of the rancher who goes and he buys wild horses. And he doesn't buy the wild horse for what the wild horse is when he buys it. That's not the point. He buys the wild horse for what the wild horse will become. And what he becomes is tame. And so he buys the wild horse, and the wild horse does him no good until he sees that the wild horse is broken. I can remember seeing this horse that was it was huge. It was a huge horse. And this horse had all of the qualities of a thoroughbred. And if it wanted to, it could crush a man easily. And yet there he is, high-stepping through the gates and changing directions at the simplest of commands. And what is that if it's not strength that has been harnessed, that has been brought under control? Again, a horse could easily trample a person and kill a person. But there they are, following simple directions. You see, that's meekness. That's gentleness. And so when Jesus said, blessed are the meek, he's not saying blessed are the soft and blessed are the sickly and blessed are the passive people who never get bothered or upset by anything. That's not what he's saying, because Jesus, did he get upset? Sure he did. He most certainly did. That's not what meekness is all about. Meekness, he is saying, blessed is the man who has himself under control. Blessed is the man who learns to harness that strength and bring it under the control of God. I guess a one-word definition of meekness could be discipline. Discipline. Now you go back to that fictitious quote I made about the Florida coach, where I said what we need here are more meek players. Well, when you understand the definition of meekness, again, he's right, isn't he? He's right. There's no way a team is ever going to win on any level unless those players are disciplined, unless they play under control. Who's out there to make sure that they stay under control? Well, you've got coaches, you've got referees, you've got people who are going to make sure that everything stays under control. And what happens when a player loses control? What happens to his team? Well, when one person loses control, the whole team is penalized, aren't they? The whole team suffers because one player is out of control. And when you have a team, when you have people like that, they're not going to be disciplined. And they're not going to win. And that's true on any level. That's also true with God's people. When a Christian is out of control in society, out in the world living like they ought not to, does that hurt the rest of us? Sure does. It does, and we all need to think about that. Meekness. I remember the TV show back in the 70s. You know, now they've got Marvel and everything, but The Incredible Hulk. Remember the 70s version of that show? And that show would begin by talking about the raging power from within. And that was the point. He didn't have control over that power. If you remember, the slightest little thing would set him off. And the slightest thing would send him into a rage. We'll call that flying off the handle. It's a picture of someone, again, who is totally out of control. And Jesus is saying, if you're going to be my disciple, you're going to have to be disciplined. You're going to have to be meek. You're going to have to be humble. You're going to have to harness your strength. You're going to have to let God do the leading and understand that you're not in charge. None of us are in charge. God leads you, and you go wherever he takes you. I wrote down 3 examples of meekness. 3 quick examples. Number 1, Moses. Why Moses? Well, Moses is called the meekest man in all the earth. So if you talk about meekness, obviously Moses needs to be an example. But here's my question. When did he get to be that way? You see, Moses got to be meek when Moses did what we're talking about. When Moses decided to let God do the leading and to do things in God's time and in God's way. When Moses killed the Egyptian in a fit of rage, he was not being very meek in that situation. But when God finally got him tamed, you might say, do you remember when God met him in the burning bush? And Moses gave him every kind of excuse that you can imagine as to why he couldn't go down there and speak to Pharaoh. And God said, no, you're going. It's going to be you. You're the man. You're going. And Moses became meek. He became meek when he finally got up and did what God said to do. Now, was that easy for Moses to do that? Of course not. Think about who was Pharaoh. Does Pharaoh have any power? He was the most powerful man on the face of the earth. And here's Moses who's going to go down there and he's going to tell this man, you need to release my people. You see, you didn't tell Pharaoh anything negative. Why? Because Pharaoh would have you killed. And Moses knew that. But Moses did what God asked him to do. And that took a lot of courage. Took a lot of courage. But then think about Simon Peter. That's a good example for us. We talk about someone who is out of control. Sometimes Simon was like that. He was just out of control. He was impetuous. He was impulsive. In John chapter 18, in the garden, remember Peter draws his sword. Why? Why did he draw his sword? Well, here comes these guards, and Peter draws the sword, and he's willing to spill his blood for Jesus. And of course, had Jesus not intervened, he very well could have spilled his blood. That took a lot of courage on Peter's part. But that is not what meekness is all about. What Peter didn't have and what he had to learn to have was self-control. But when you get to the book of Acts, you see a completely different person in Peter, don't you? You see a man who is threatened. You see a man who is beaten. You see a man who is thrown into prison. He is commanded to stop preaching Jesus. And the words of Simon ring throughout all the ages when he said, "We must obey God rather than man." There's meekness right there. There it is. The impetuous, sometimes out of control Peter becomes a man whose strength has been harnessed and tamed, and now he has self-control. Then I think about James and John. Look at Luke chapter 9. Let's look at James and John in Luke chapter 9, beginning in verse 52. Luke chapter 9, beginning in verse 52. He sent messengers ahead of himself, and on the way they entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. But they did not welcome him because he determined to journey to Jerusalem. So, what did they suggest that Jesus do? If you remember, they said, "Lord, they won't listen to you, so let's send fire down from heaven. Let's destroy everyone." Remember, they were very passionate about this. James and John, do you remember their nicknames? You remember the nicknames that Jesus gave them? He called them sons of thunder. We have nicknames today. Jesus gave some of his men nicknames. He called them sons of thunder. And I think that is descriptive of who they were in those early days. They were a couple of tough guys. And I think that toughness is revealed there in Luke chapter 9. But when you get to the book of Acts, once again, you see completely different men. Completely different. You see James and John, totally different. James puts his head on the block for the Lord in Acts chapter 12. John is eventually banished to the island of Patmos. And the sons of thunder have become men who had self-control. Moses had the strength to kill an Egyptian. Peter had the courage to draw his sword. James and John had the grit to destroy anybody who wouldn't listen to Jesus. Here are men who had strength, they had courage, they had grit, but one thing they didn't have was control. That was the one thing that they lacked. The one thing they hadn't learned to do yet was to allow God to lead them, and they to humbly and meekly follow. But yet all of those men became meek over time. Aristotle said that meekness is halfway between extreme anger and extreme angerlessness. It's the right kind of anger, but in the right time, in the right quantity, on the right occasion, and in the right way. In other words, it is strength that has been harnessed. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26 says, "Be angry and do not sin." One more illustration. In John chapter 2, at the time of the Passover, John chapter 2, he comes near the temple and he observes something that's going on there. He finds merchandising. You see that in verse 14. But in verse 15, look at what he does. In John chapter 2, beginning of verse 15. After making a whip out of cords, he drove everyone out of the temple with their sheep and oxen. He also poured out the money changers' coins and overturned the tables. He told those who were selling doves, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." Was Jesus being meek on that occasion? Was Jesus being meek on this occasion? Well, first of all, Jesus took time to make a whip. He took time to think things through. He sat there and he made that whip. But when he got ready to use it, how many Jewish merchants who were making a lot of money, how many Jewish merchants stood up and took him on? Nobody. Nobody did. Now these men, this was their livelihood. Don't you think for a minute that they're going to allow a weak, need, mamby, pamby, sissy, and sandals come and drive them out of the temple? It wasn't going to happen. But when Jesus stood up and cracked the whip and threw over those tables, every merchant backed off. And I'm going to tell you something. That is one of the greatest examples of meekness anywhere in Scripture. Because it is strength under control. What could he have done? What could he have done to all of them? Think about it. Jesus could have destroyed every last one of them. He could have struck them all dead that very moment. Somebody said the depth of meekness in a man is gauged in direct proportion to his ability to crush his adversary. Jesus was not meek because he was powerless. He was meek because he had unlimited power, but he kept it under control. This is one who allowed them to put the crown of thorns on his head. He allowed them to put a robe on his back and a reed in his hand and nail him to a cross. Meekness is not weakness. Jesus had the power to call down legions of angels. It would only taken one to do the job. But he could have called down legions of angels, but he didn't. Why? Because he was meek. His strength was under control. That's why Paul said in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 8, "And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. And you can't mourn unless you're poor in spirit. And blessed are the meek. You cannot be meek until you have mourned the sin in your life and allow God to lead you. We'll continue, Lord willing, next Sunday. If you're here this morning and you've not yet rendered obedience to the gospel of Christ, we simply ask that you follow God's command, be baptized into Christ for the forgiveness of your sins, and become a part of his family. As we always talk about, God's time is now. Now is the accepted time. Now is the day of salvation. Nobody's guaranteed to make it to 2025, even though it's only a few weeks away. None of us are. We could die. The Lord could return at any moment. Are you ready for that? Are you ready to die? Are you ready for the Lord to return? Only you can answer that question. We can't answer it for you. And if right now you're saying, "I'm not ready," then you need to take action. If you're not baptized, you need to be baptized into Christ. If you are baptized, you need to make sure you ask God to forgive you, repent of those things, and turn from those things. If you have a need, whatever it is, we ask that you make it known right now as together we stand and sing the invitation song.